You made your choice, and I made mine. Rye immediately realized that this was about intervention. It was obvious that Christine was the spokesperson for the group. We wanted to talk to you about it. Rye looked at his wife, but her expression was impassive. He hoped it wasn't what he thought it was. He looked at his daughter again. What about Mom? Mom told us about Luke. She told you, did she? Rye asked incredulously. Yes, and about your problems. Ray just stared at his wife, shocked that she would share such personal information with anyone, let alone their children and grandchildren. My problems as well as this. The full story is none of your concern, but your mother's happiness is our business. Your mother's happiness is your business. I suppose that means my happiness doesn't matter, and I have to give up everything I care about. Christine sighed. But your mother has needs, and you can't meet them if you had needs she couldn't fulfill. Do you think she would stop you for the first time since this whole thing started? Josie flinched and suddenly found a spot on the dinner table that interested her. She said, Christine, stop. Everyone looked at her, then at me, and I started laughing. Oh, Christine, I said. I think you just made the biggest mistake ever. Then I asked, would you like to hear an interesting story? Josie stood up and yelled, Ray, don't do that. I laughed and replied, it's your mess, you deal with it. So where do I start? When you were born, your mother gave up on love for almost 3 years. She couldn't fulfill my needs. She even wrote me a letter. I have the letter right here, let me quote it to you. I pulled the letter from my top pocket. I had kept it in my sock drawer all these years because I was pleased that I had sacrificed part of my life for my wife's love and happiness. Now I wanted to see my wife squirm at the hypocrisy. I quoted her directly. I know you have needs, and I just can't fulfill them right now. It would be so easy for you to go out and find a woman who could do it, but if you did, the pain you would cause me would be immense, and our marriage would not survive. I am asking, not begging. Please don't go outside of our marriage. I need you to put your needs aside for a while this depression dissipates. I don't know how long it will last, but hopefully soon. Please remain faithful to me, as I have been faithful to you. If the roles were reversed, so for almost 3 years we had no love at the end of the 3-year period. During the year-long period, we only had sex once, and it resulted in Leo. It took another 4 years of infrequent sex, meaning once every 2 months or so, before our sex life returned to normal. Christine, your mom and I hadn't had sex or had sex very infrequently for almost 7 years. I hadn't looked beyond our marriage. Was I a devoted husband or a deadbeat? That's what people were asking. Josie's face flushed with humiliation and anger. I knew quoting her own words wouldn't please her, because she always thought I should give her more than she gave me. Christine was knocked out but still pulled herself together. Dad, it was a long time ago and you may never recover, so Mom may never experience it again. My laughter filled the room. I looked at Eric and realized that Christine is going through something similar right now. If I were you, I'd go out and have sex with anyone who wants it, because in 20 years she'll want the same. Christine blushed and asked who told you that. I simply replied, your mom told me a few weeks ago that you have the same problem she does. I assume you won't mind Eric getting his needs met, while Christine stuttered and simmered with anger. I looked at Rebecca and asked how her life was going. It seemed like a good time to bring up Leo and get him ready to play on the field. When you get a break, a lot of angry faces looked at me. I smiled and said, you all seem happy to be the ones being taken care of, but very unhappy to be in my shoes. Christine came up to me and said, this is different. My mom needs this and you can't do it. Get over it. I looked at all of them and said goodbye. I turned on my heels and headed for the door. Julie and Allison shouted after me, what about the fireworks? There are enough fireworks for tonight. I replied, go ahead and enjoy them. I suspect my presence will spoil the fun for everyone. I walked to the car and got in as I backed out of the driveway. Josie stood in the doorway but made no attempt to stop me for a while. I drove around, not knowing what to do after. It was the 4th of July, but everything was closed. My phone rang with Rebecca's number on it. She'd left a voicemail saying she was sorry about the ambush and that she and Leo agreed it was wrong, but Christine had basically forced them to agree. About 30 minutes later, I was outside the firm's office, so I drove up, parked, and went inside. I should have had a cup of coffee. I was sitting at my desk, drinking a cup of Josie's decaf coffee, when I decided to write a list of possible options. The first word that came to mind was divorce. I don't know why it was there, but it was. I sat there, enjoying my coffee, thinking about that word and realizing that I had no choice. If I wanted to be honest with myself, I had to admit that I had given up my needs for her. But when the roles were, she refused to reverse it, no matter how much she hid. Everyone would still find out, and I just couldn't live that life. It would be a divorce. So what's next? The words, "to live and divorce lawyer," appeared on the page like magic. I opened my computer and typed "divorce lawyer" into Google. Page after page of results appeared. On the second page, I saw a name I recognized, Lindsay Logan. She was I was working on a divorce case for one of my good friends. We'd met through a charity we both supported. She was young, attractive, but that just made meetings easier. She was also a bit of an elephant in a china shop when the situation called for it. I went to her website and filled out a form proposing a meeting. I got an automated response saying I'd be called back within 24 hours. She said she could meet me now, and we could talk about where I should live. I told her I couldn't live alone, and I couldn't cook, clean, or wash my own clothes. But I didn't want to go into a nursing home. In fact, I was thinking about a commercial I saw recently. It was an advertisement for a nursing home on the other side of town. It housed people who were recently divorced and needed exactly what I needed: a housekeeper. Each person had their own apartment. The front door led out to the car park, and the back door led into a space where a small restaurant provided meals, laundry cleaning and ironing of clothes, and a maid to clean the apartment. After a few Google searches, I had the phone number for this establishment. I called, forgetting what day it was, and was surprised to be answered. It turned out that the manager or assistant manager were on the premises 24/7 and would be happy to show me around any time I asked if I could come in now. I was told that I could, so I went in. The drive from the office to the property took about 45 minutes, mostly due to road closures for the fireworks display. The manager showed me around the property and the apartment that was up for rent. I was surprised to find that I was familiar with 2 of the tenants and was invited to watch the game with them. I had a great time in the living room with old friends and a few new ones. I even managed to have a beer after the game. Sam, who we used to go fishing with before we got married, asked me why I was there. My wife decided she wanted a younger model. I replied that it's hard for her to understand why I'm not happy. Sam looked at me and said, "Josie's always been a selfish fool, but this is colder than I thought." I looked at him, surprised. "Did you know her?" Sam made a strange face and said, "Sure. I was friends with her brother. I dated her when we were 12. 6 weeks was a lifetime. We lived next door until we were 15. I wondered if I should have known that. When we went fishing, you lived in Hillview." "Yeah," Sam replied. "My parents moved there just before we met. Then we kind of lost touch when you were dating Josie." "I guess she didn't. I want you around me, but I kept you away from me. You always had weekends where the guys would go out and stuff like that. You lost touch with all the guys. How many of your friends now were your friends before you met Josie? How many were Josie's friends after you met?" It was an interesting question. I knew the answer immediately. It was a shock, but it wasn't. I always did everything I tried to make her happy, but if there was a conflict between her happiness and mine, she always won. This was just the ultimate display of selfishness. I went to the manager's office and said I would take the apartment. We did the paperwork, and I pulled out my card to put down a deposit. The manager looked at it and said, "I think you should open a new account before you pay me. You don't want your future ex. My wife wants to know where I am at all times." I didn't even have time to think about banking, phones, etc. He suggested I go to a new bank and open an account tomorrow. He also said I needed a smartphone for bank and social apps. I had a face that made him laugh. He said, "Don't worry, 1 week here and you'll think of your smartphone as an old friend." I drove home to an empty house. The fireworks were already over, and I knew they would dismantle the canopies and get home. It was about 11:30, so I had about 45 minutes. Once I got to the office, I gathered all the financial info the attorney had asked for in the email. I kept everything in folders so it was easy to copy everything. I put it all in the car and sat down as the others came through the door. Everyone stopped and looked at me like I'd just popped the balloons. Christine turned around and said, "Everyone go home. Mom and I are going to finish this with Dad." The rest of us couldn't wait to get out of the house. Josie and Christine stood in the doorway, looking at me while I sat in my chair and watched them. Josie started by asking why I'd brought up they were personal issues. "And this letter was written from the heart. I'm upset that you used it against me," Christine continued. "You ruined a day that was supposed to be perfect with your issues, and then left like a cranky child." I didn't move or speak, I just stared at them. Eventually Josie yelled, "Well, then say something. I'd like an apology. And then I'd like you to call Luke and tell him that the body bag comment was out of line. I started with Joe, and then I announced that your affair is over. If he ever shows up in this house again, we're divorced. Get that excuse-making daughter out of this house before I say something she'll regret." Christine looked at me. With disgust in her eyes, she said there would be no divorce. "So figure out how to deal with your bruised ego. If I hear you lay a finger on Luke, you will never see your granddaughters again." I stood up and walked over to Christine, intending to intimidate her. It was obvious that the look on my face scared her as my anger boiled over. I took a couple of steps back. Josie stepped between us and said, "Christine, go away and I'll deal with your father." Christine quickly left the house. Josie said, "How dare you threaten your daughter like that?" As I walked up the stairs, I said, "I'm moving into the spare room. I'm sick of being in the same room with you. Sleeping in the same bed is out." I moved some of my stuff into the spare room and locked the door. Josie used the spare key to unlock it, but I stood at the door and said, "I'm going to push you out of this room if you don't leave. I have no interest in being with you." Her face reflected surprise and shock, but she backed away from the door, which I slept pretty well, all things considered. The next morning, I was up and out before Josie got up. The first thing I did was go to the office to ask for a few days' vacation. I explained to my supervisor what had happened, and he said it was okay to take a week off without using up my vacation entitlement. The next morning, the attorney's office gave me a call and set up a meeting for 3. At 3 p.m., I agreed to that time and then went to the bank to open a new account. The bank employee showed me how the banking app worked, and I verified that it was very simple. Everything was set up to transfer half of the funds to my new account. I then went to the mall and bought a new cell phone on contract. I went back to the bank and they set up the mobile banking app for me. And then I went to the nursing home and used it to pay the deposit. I went to a furniture store and ordered a new bed, furniture, a TV, and so on for my new apartment. I asked them to deliver everything to the apartment by Wednesday, and I also bought 2 large suitcases at 3:30. I was sitting outside my future lawyer's office. The receptionist told me to come through, and as I entered her office, I was shocked. I always remembered Lindsay as attractive, but now she was a vision sitting in front of me. She looked up and smiled. "You've changed since the last time we spoke," I said. The smile turned to laughter. I was about 15 years old. I just couldn't contain my smile when I said it. I bet she didn't remember me from charity events, where she must have dressed less than elaborately. After that, the meeting was entirely business-related. I told her what had happened and gave her all the financial information. The offer was that she would keep the house half. I offered her half of my savings and $500 a month in spousal support for 2 years. I'd keep my pension and she'd have to keep working. The papers were due the following Friday, but I asked that they be served Saturday morning. I got home at the usual time and ignored Josie. I moved my things into the spare room and then took the opportunity to pack my new. I took her suitcases to the car the next morning while she was still up. I left them in the apartment. I'll unload them when the furniture arrives. All that was left in my old house was a week's worth of clothes and everything dirty. After checking a few things, I went to the office. My boss asked what I was doing there. I told him nothing. I might as well get some work done. In fact, I had a very productive day and arrived home about an hour later than usual, grabbing a bite to eat at a health food store near the office. Josie looked at me and said, "I cooked the lamb, but it went bad. Why are you late?" I just looked at her and went to the spare room, locking the door. I heard. Josie knocked on the door. "We need to talk. We can't go on living like this." I opened the door. "Wow, Sherlock. I can't live with you cheating on me every weekend until this is over. Nothing is going to change." Her face turned red and she screamed, "You have no respect for my feelings, needs, or happiness. You have to man up and work on this marriage or it will be a thing of I couldn't help but laugh. I think you need to take a good look in the mirror and ask yourself if you have any respect for my feelings, needs, or happiness. Now, please leave me alone." The rest of the week passed in silence. On Thursday, I went to put all my stuff away after work because new furniture had been brought in. I also went to buy new bedding and other necessities. On Friday, I gathered all my dirty clothes into a bag and took them to the laundry room at the new house. On Saturday morning, I got up and packed the last of my clothes and medications into a bag I took with me to the golf outing. Then I went downstairs, where I found Josie sitting at the table. She told me that if the golf didn't happen because of the rain, I shouldn't get home until 10. "So you don't see anything you don't want to. So there you have it. You don't care about my feelings. You're continuing your relationship with this Luke guy, and I have nothing to do with your plans. She looked at me with a sad smile. You're the most important thing, but you can't take care of that part of my life, so I need someone to help. I stood up. Okay, you made your choice and I made mine. I went to the door and she asked, no kiss? I turned around and laughed. Never again. I drove to Lindsay's office where I met with her and the bailiff, and drove back to my old house in the BFF's car. We parked a few houses away from the house and waited around 8:30. Luke pulled up to the house at 8:45. The bailiff came to the door. It took several minutes before Josie answered. She was dressed in clothes that clearly showed she'd wasted no time. I saw the bailiff turn to her. She nodded. Then he pulled an envelope out of his bag and held it out to her. She refused to accept it. He spoke to her again, and this time she took the envelope. He left. I saw Josie open the. She put her hand over her mouth and slammed the door shut. Less than 5 minutes later, Luke left the house and drove away. The first call was from Christine. It rang for 10 minutes. I picked up the phone and heard the tirade. What is this crap? Divorcing my mom for what? Being nice to her? I let Christine speak until there was silence on the phone. I sat there for another 30 seconds passed, then I said, Are you done? A new stream of swear words began, which I just let pass. Finally, she stopped and asked, Well, my answer. Well, what made her hang up? Lindsay and I finished the final papers so they could be turned over to Josie's attorney. I also gave Lindsay limited power of attorney and the right to represent me in court, in case I didn't show up when I was leaving. I saw Leo parked outside Lindsay's office. He looked at me and said, We're all looking for your car. I'm here to drive you home so you can get this nonsense over with. I walked past him and headed for my car, but when I reached for the door, he held out his hand, stopping me from opening it. He said, Get in my car now. I didn't move from my seat, but he said, If you don't take your hand away right now, as at that moment Lindsay came up behind Leo and put her hand on his shoulder. My client wants to leave, and you are preventing him from doing so. If you don't get out of his way, I will make sure that you spend 30 days in the county jail and appear before the judge on the charge of false imprisonment. And you're not going to like this, Leo, but you're too beautiful to spend 30 days in the county jail. I opened the door to get in as quickly as I could when I had one foot in the car. This isn't over, Dad. You're not divorcing Mom and moving out of the house, he said. With those words, he walked to his car. Lindsay looked at me. I think this is going to be messy. I went back to the office and got messy. Then I drove to my apartment, making sure I parked so it wouldn't be visible from the road. On Sunday, I met with my housekeeper. We discussed my medications, diet, and other things related to my heart condition. They had a system in place to make sure all medications were taken and all meals met dietary requirements. On Monday afternoon, everything came to a head. Lindsay called to say that Josie had hired an attorney, and the first thing they did was get a protective order. It said that I couldn't take care of myself, and asked the court to put me in Josie and Kristen's custody because of my heart condition. The preliminary hearing was set for 10. The next morning, Lindsay asked for my doctor's and facility manager's contact details so she could prepare a defense at 10. The hearing was scheduled for the morning, and Josie's attorney stood up and said that I was incapable of taking care of myself, and that Josie had complete control over my medical condition. They said that I should be placed in her custody. Josie was called to testify, and gave a very biased opinion of my ability to care for myself. Things took a turn when Lindsay asked her what she'd do about the divorce petition if it was granted. Josie replied that she'd revoke it. Lindsay then turned to the judge and said, Your Honor, this is an attempt to stop the divorce. It has nothing to do with my client's Lindsay then called the facility manager, who explained that it was a nursing home and they had a system in place to ensure that medications were taken and dietary requirements were met. She then called my doctor to the stand, who had visited the facility to review the process and said it was as good as anything he'd seen. He'd seen it and had no problems. The judge looked at Josie's attorney and called him to the stand after a heated discussion. The judge said, I won't grant this order because it's obvious the medical evidence is contrived. The real reason is to try to stop the divorce. All dismissed after we left the doctor, who turned to me and said, Call me. I've looked at your medication charts, and I think we need to review them. Christine stayed behind while Lindsay was talking to the doctor. When he left, she said, Dad, this isn't over. You have to get over your ego and get back to Mom, otherwise she'll sign those papers. I laughed and said, Oh, please let her do it and hurry up. The next day I noticed you're still taking a high dose of ACE, which is causing your blood pressure to be too low. I think we need to take you off it altogether. At your last checkup, your blood pressure was indeed too low. Starting today, I want the dose reduced by 10 mg a week. I will send a letter. Over the next 2 months, the dose of blood pressure medication was reduced to 0. About 2 weeks after the last appointment, Sam and I were sitting watching TV when the manager brought in a woman who wanted to rent one of the apartments. I found her attractive, and the slight arousal was a strange, disconcerting but very pleasant sensation. I hadn't experienced it in a very long time. The first hearing on the divorce petition eventually took place after Josie had put up every possible obstacle. Lindsay presented the petition as a simple, irreconcilable divorce and asked that it be granted without delay. Josie's attorney, the judge, said that the reason for the divorce was a misunderstanding on my part and that we should have 12 counseling sessions, which is the maximum in our state, so that we could work out the issues and find a way to move forward. The judge then looked at Lindsay and said, "Your client has been married for a long time. I think they should see if anything can be salvaged." He said he'd look into it and address the court as a whole. He said he'd schedule 3 counseling sessions, and that the counselor would have to report back to him on progress. The counselor would have to be agreed upon by both parties. The decision about the counselor was pretty traumatic. Josie's first suggestion was to use one of her friends from the golf club. This suggestion was immediately rejected. We eventually settled on a counselor who Lindsay knew was impartial. The first session didn't go well from the start. Josie began by saying that she had needs and that it was unreasonable of me to prevent them from being met. She was angry when I explained that adultery was involved. She was really angry and said that it was a simple need and that I wasn't up to the job. She also said that she couldn't stay faithful under those circumstances, even though I'd produced her letter, which she tried to take from the counselor. The counselor said that she didn't see marriage as equal. The second session was even worse. Christine stormed in midway through and demanded that the counselor tell me to stop being selfish and tell the judge to stop the divorce. After the second session, the counselor wrote a letter to the judge saying there was no point in continuing because there was no chance of saving the marriage. Over the next 3 months, Josie's lawyer used every procedural tool to delay the divorce. They asked for medical and psychiatric evaluations, claiming that I was mentally unstable and that my medications made it impossible for me to make rational decisions. The final attempt came 2 days before the final hearing. I was found capable of making independent decisions. Lindsay filed a motion with the court to make that hearing final. It probably should have been granted that evening after dinner. I sat in the living room and talked with Angela, the new tenant whose presence had caused me to stir. We had become friends, and the mutual attraction grew with the excitement in me. I spoke to the doctor again, who explained that my ACE dose was too high and I literally couldn't pump blood to my extremities. It turned out that Josie had demanded that the medication be kept high, believing it would be better for my health. While we were talking, 2 police officers and an elegantly dressed man came up and asked who I was. I gave my name, and the man handed me an envelope. It said that my children had been granted temporary rights under an indefinite power of attorney, and that I was to be placed in protective custody until a full hearing. As I was being physically escorted out of the building, I yelled to Angela to call Lindsay Logan, my attorney, and ask her to find me. I was taken to a local hospital, where I was placed on a bed in a secure ward. About 2 hours later, I heard Lindsay at the counter, but she was told that the attorney's POA, a legal authorization that gives an agent or trustee the authority to act on behalf of a person called a fiduciary, had instructed that she was not allowed to see me at 9. The next morning, Lindsay and the bailiff came into my room. The nurse who was following them said, "You can't come in here." The bailiff turned around and handed her a piece of paper that said, "This is a power of attorney that says we have the right to gain access by any means necessary if you obstruct me." The nurse quickly stepped aside, and Lindsay walked over to me with the words, "Get up and get out of here." The bailiff took the handcuffs off, and we made a run for it, literally, out of the hospital and into a cab. Lindsay drove me to her house and sat me down for a coffee to explain everything. When I had my heart attack, I had signed a power of attorney for my kids. This gave them the right to make decisions about my medical care and finances in the event I became incapacitated. Yesterday, they activated it, declaring me mentally incompetent and admitted me to the hospital. They have a hearing scheduled for 10. I'm up at 000. And if they succeed in keeping me out of it, they'll gain control of me and all my legal affairs. Lindsay's plan was for me to be present in court, but since the kids had informed the police that I was a danger to myself and others, We had to be careful. We left Lindsay's house at 9. We got a cab to the courthouse and went in through the back door at 10. At 000, the court hearing was announced. And as Lindsay entered the courtroom and took a seat at the table for my defense, Christine's attorney objected, saying that she had been removed from the case under the POA and could not represent me. Lindsay stood up and said, "Please ask Mr. Mulholland yourself," and called on me. The kids jumped up, but the judge, I told them to sit down and said I had a right to be there. The judge looked at me and said, "Why are you here?" Lindsay stood up and said, "My client is in the process of divorcing his wife, and this is an attempt to prevent him from doing so." The judge looked at his papers and said, "Why is there no mention of divorce in these papers? This is clearly an abuse of the POA. I'm dismissing this case, Miss Logan. When is the divorce hearing? It's in about an hour." She replied. The judge looked at the children's attorney and said that if there are any objections to the divorce decree, both of your clients will go to the district court for 21 days. The divorce went smoothly, and 3 months later, I'm a single man. What happened to Angela? Well, the night the divorce judgment was entered, we had a party. While we were dancing, we started to feel things for each other. We were in bed together and cemented our friendship. We don't chase it like rabbits, but once a week for a heart attack victim makes us both happy. The end.